Hello and welcome to another episode of The Art of Writing. This week's episode is on setting, the most important part of writing. The setting determines where we're going to be and what we're going to be doing. So, let us begin. As I've already stated, this is where it's going to take place. Your setting drives your plot. That's basically what it comes down to. It gives your characters purpose. Without purpose, your characters aren't doing anything. Your heroes aren't slaying the dragon if there's no dragon to be slain. That's what it comes down to. There's a lot of major settings. Let's break that down. So you have science fiction. And I've seen two major versions of science fiction. You have dystopian science fiction, which looks into Star Wars, Expanse, that kind of stuff. And then you have utopian science fiction, which breaks down into your Star Trek. And, well, Star Trek's really the only one. Because even Dune, while it's sci-fi, falls under dystopian. And then you have all your punks. You have cyberpunk, biopunk, solar punk, diesel punk, atomic punk. That would be an interesting small episode to break down and go through the different versions of punk. And then you have fantasy, and you have high fantasy, you have low fantasy. What splits them apart is magic. If you're just writing a book about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, that's low fantasy. That's where you're looking at men with swords fighting against other men with swords. Game of Thrones is another good option. Even though Game of Thrones does have magic, it's not a lot of magic. Whereas high fantasy, that's where you're looking at, oh wow, the mages and the witches and the dragons are causing havoc. That necromancers. That's the big difference between those two. The setting, your setting needs to have an inciting incident. Break it down to, if you are a hero being tasked by the king to save the princess from the dragon, that means your inciting incident was the dragon stole the princess. So, one of my favorite books ever is Kings of the Wild. And the inciting incident is there's a siege going on in a far off land. And the main character's best friend's daughter is stuck there. And the main character and his best friend now go around and get together all their old retired friends, and they go to save the daughter. It's a great setup. Another great start is a fantasy world where the king passes away, and now all the factions under the king are fighting for power. In Game of Thrones, that's basically what it is. Whereas Game of Thrones, we got to see the inciting incident from the beginning. We got to watch it lead up and then the ball roll. Star Wars, there's a rebellion. And the Empire, the evil Empire, has created a super weapon that now the heroes must stop. Next, from here, we're going to move on to three main points. This is how you're going to build your setting. In setting, you need to be able to describe what is going on in your world in 1 to 2 sentences, or just a single run-on sentence. This is how you're going to really decide what you're going to be doing and where your heroes are going to be. However, there are 3 things that I have seen through writing. 3 points: time, location, and theme. Time is, let's look at Star Wars once again. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, boom, now you have your time and location. Now, the theme is going to be your twist on a regular story. There's space wizards that use magic. That's pretty dope. But when we really break that down and take that a step back, it's just the Magnificent Seven. Step that back, it's the Seven Samurai. It's the same story that's been told over and over again, just with a new theme. This is going to be your broadest setting, is the broadest thing you're going to look at when you're going to write. And it's really easy to wrap yourself up in how many different things are there to look at. Like, you can create an entire city and put millions of people in it, but in reality, are we going to read a book about millions of people? No, not really. And then, moving on, one of the things that I have seen that has struck my interest the most is reflection. If your setting does not reflect your main character's internal conflict, then it can still be a good book, but it is not good writing. Because your character must overcome the external to then overcome the internal, or vice versa. So they have to overcome their problems inside to overcome the problems outside. We'll talk more about this in our protagonist episode, but there's ideas of failed heroes. Like, you save the princess, but you don't overcome being trapped in yourself, of going out and saving the day. That may never happen. On to our next point, building our setting. There's 4 steps in my mind, and I've seen it. We can go through the steps together in different categories. Spitball. What do you want? What kind of story do you want to tell? Do you want to tell samurais in space? Do you want to tell about knights in space? I love sci-fi, so I always look to science fiction before I look towards fantasy. However, in fantasy, where dragons have died off a long time ago until they came back, what kind of story does that persist of? Then you design it. Like, what kind of world are we living in? Are we living in a monarchy? Are we living in an empire? Are we living in... Where is your character at the start? And where are they going to end up at the end? And then you're going to structure. Structure is going to be the most annoying one because it's layers. It's all it really is. All setting is layers. We know what we want to be doing. Okay, now let's go to the next layer. How does that fit into our plot? Which we'll talk about more in the plot episode. However, you're going to stack up these layers on top of one another until you get to the final, let's start writing. And when we start writing, well, in honesty, you could start writing now. But if you don't know what you're writing, it's going to make it very hard to write it, if that makes sense. And then you're going to fill, which is going to be your plot, your protagonist, your antagonist, your point that you're trying to get across, your underlying themes, and that. Now, I wanted to take a moment and look at what kind of settings we've already seen and what we can infer from those. Star Wars is a great one because they have 3 different settings. You have the Galactic Empire setting, which is episodes 4, 5, and 6. You have the Galactic War setting, which is episodes 1, 2, and 3. And then you have the rise of a new generation of heroes. I don't know necessarily what setting they were going for in episodes 7, 8, 9, but I don't feel it worked very well. And that's where I think they struggled. George Lucas had a very straightforward plan when he wrote episodes 4, 5, 6. And then he goes back in episodes 1, 2, 3. He had a plan. And then 7, 8, 9, there was no plan. The setting was just like, what can we build on top of these 2 things? And it just didn't work that well. Then let's take a look at Star Trek. Star Trek is an always going on story that is about exploration and the problems with exploration, interesting events that happen, dealing with new cultures, dealing with new peoples. It's the how do I feel different than you? It's very much philosophical. That's all Star Trek has ever been. It's a philosophical debate. Now, let's take a look at Warhammer. I can't talk about science fiction and not talk about Warhammer. Warhammer starts off when you get into it. There is one section that is very keen on knowing what you're about to get into. It reads, we are in the 41st millennium. There is nothing but war. The stories told are from different perspectives. What can we infer from that? We're not going to be reading books about love and romance, even though there's love and romance in these books. We are going to be reading about battlefields, war, the destruction that war causes. Then we're going to look at, second line. This is told from many different perspectives. So we know there's going to be multiple people telling the same story, so there's going to be issues in the telling of it. People are going to have different perspectives. Setting is also the point where I would like to figure out what kind of story I'm telling, like what perspective I'm telling it from. Point of view, where you have first person, you have third person limited, and then you have third person omniscient. These are the three major ones. There is a fourth one that they don't tell you or teach you in school, and that is second person. That is a story being told from a second-hand account. And it's a very interesting concept that we don't see anymore. It was very common in Greek writing and Greek poetry and Greek plays. However, nobody really writes that anymore because it has fallen out of favor. Now, fantasy. Fantasy is great because you can do whatever you want with it. And honestly, it's pretty easy to break down. You're going to have something big that the heroes or adventurers or knights have to deal with, whether that be war or monster. That's coming into the 2 points. We'll talk about this more when we get into plot. There's I believe 18 different versions of what your story can be about, and I'll be putting that in our slides when we talk about it. But that's pretty much all setting is. It's framework to build your world, build your story on. If you don't have framework, it's really hard to build a house. Same with writing. You need to know where you started and where you're going. Thank you very much, and that has been another episode of The Art of Writing Setting. Next week we will be talking about plot.